So good afternoon, everybody. Uh, so today I'll be presenting on a very recent paper of mine that got published. And I was working with Professor Eugene Pinsky from Boston University on this particular project. And we started this project early 2025. And our purpose with this project really was that in the growing and burgeoning times of artificial intelligence, and with so much money flowing into this nascent stream of AI technology, what is a palatable framework through which we can look at macroeconomic changes that are happening right now and are likely to happen in the future? So with that question in mind, we actually started with pulling the macroeconomic data from the World Bank website. And what our focus was really in this particular paper was to look at something called as a repetitive counter-cyclical phenomena, wherein because this technology is very nascent and over a period of time, we will see more investment coming in and the economy sort of changing in its own idiosyncratic way. What are the potential pitfalls? Where is going to be the maximum growth? And what are some other possibilities that we might see over the next few years in the economy? And to do that, we pulled a bunch of macroeconomic factors from the World Bank website. In particular, our focus was nominal GDP growth, inflation, and debt. That is what we started off with. And we really wanted to see where we can go with this particular project, because initially, we were quite clueless. What are we going to be actually even working on? And one of the questions actually that really came up very quickly is, first of all, let's look at what are some of the idiosyncratic relationships that we currently have of these macroeconomic factors. So there were two in particular that stood out across countries in Western Europe and North America, which was the high positive relationship between inflation and nominal GDP growth, and sort of a negative but significantly lesser in magnitude relationship between debt and nominal GDP growth. Now, this is very important in the later half of the presentation as well, because what we will essentially see is how the heterogeneity in how the economy affects these countries plays a vital role in how these trends shift across time. So having said that, we specifically, as I mentioned right at the beginning, we made sure that our research is curtailed within countries in Scandinavia, North America, and Western Europe, because those were the demographics that had a significant amount of data going all the way back, almost 70 to 80 years. And at the same time, we really wanted to see something very important, and this is a question that really started this presentation and, started this paper, and the research really took off when we started asking this question is, over the last at least 40 years, we have seen numerous phases of economic downturns and economic crisis. You can go all the way back to the late 70s where we had the oil crisis, all the way back to the early 2000s where we had the dot-com bubble, and as of very recently, we had the 2008 financial crisis. So the question that we were trying to ask ourselves is whether or not these phases within the broader economic timeline have significant lessons that we can take, and we can actually steer those lessons in some tangible policy directions. And to do that, really, we wanted to see what are some of the common themes that gets repeated over these different phases of economic crises. So our research really started off with this seminal paper, concomitantly a book that was published by two economists, Cameron Reinhart and Kenneth Rogoff. And they titled their paper and their book, This Time is Different. Now, it's a title that really gets into the essence of what the thesis was about. It was about the kind of hypotheses that oftentimes investors and policymakers have when they look at certain macroeconomic conditions, but they steer the policy in the wrong direction just because in their opinion, because the times have changed over the years, certain patterns that repeated in the past or that happened in the past are less likely to repeat in the current times and in the future. One of the statistics that really stood out from the paper and the book was about the relationship between economic growth and the GDP as a percentage, or rather debt as a percentage of GDP. So one of the statistics that was pretty prevalent throughout the book was how does the economic, or where does the economic growth precipitate pretty adversely as it pertains to the debt. And the number that they came up with was 90%. Now we took that number and we wanted to see whether this really reflects in the data set that we have. So we ran two statistical tests. We ran a normal distribution agnostic statistical test, which was the Mann-Whitney-U test. And we ran another test which was more in tandem with the normal distribution. So what we really found was an sort of an interesting picture, but a picture that was really incomplete. Now, most of these countries that we were looking at the data, for whom we were looking at the data, they really showed strong valence with this statistic. And a lot of the countries were actually demonstrating economic patterns that reflected this particular hypothesis. And for most of them, actually, we had to reject our initial null hypothesis, which was that above and beyond 90%, the growth really does not precipitate to that extent. However, the interesting thing that we observed was what really happens beyond the 90%. And this is where the picture really gets interesting. Because for a lot of North American and Western countries, what we realized was that beyond 90%, something very interesting happens. For some countries, the trajectory of economic growth continues to precipitate. Whereas on the other hand, for certain countries, actually, growth starts going up, even though the debt continues to go in the negative direction. So we wanted to know what are some of the factors that were not part of the analysis of Reinhardt and Rogoff, so that we can go ahead and we can see what are those gaps and how we can bridge them. So some of the key findings that really shaped our research forward was, why is it that, especially in the United States and in the UK, even though beyond 90% the debt kept on going up, the first thing that we saw was the inflation rate was actually coming down, and growth was actually starting to pick up, albeit very slowly. And one of the reasons actually that we figured out, this is an interesting point to start, it's because the difference between what a lot of developed countries like the United States have at their disposal is strong foundation as it pertains to institutions. Now, one of the ways in which the US has controlled its debt quite deftly, sometimes to its detriment, but more often than not pretty deftly, is managing interest rates through the Central Federal Reserve. Now, that's one of the ways in which you can adjust for inflation and you can control economic growth. Now, because of an institution like central banking in the US, it's been able to control some of the adverse effects of a growing debt. But this pattern does not reflect in more developing countries across the world, and that's one of the factors that was not part of Rogoff's and Reinhardt's thesis, which was some confounding variables that oftentimes pivot and steer the economy in a specific direction that are often not spoken about in fundamental macroeconomic research. Now, continuing on that trend, we also saw something that I just spoke about, which was the inflation paradox. And just like how if you have strong institutions that can steer the economy in a specific direction by controlling certain confounding variables, what the central banking system as an institution here in the West does really well, it does manage the flow of money within and outside of the system. So you can actually increase the inflation to a certain point, you can bring the debt down while also steering growth at the same time. Because the central banking has control over that economic lever, it's able to spur some of that economic growth, even though the debt continues to go beyond 90%, which was a statistic, again, reflected in the research of Reinhardt and Rogoff. Now, the other interesting sort of variable that we saw, which was sort of what happens really pre and post crisis. And this is where also the data gets very interesting, because in the initial slides, I think what we saw was a significant relationship between the debt and the inflation, and it was a highly positive correlation. Now, if you look at when we looked at the data as it pertains to the financial crisis, just before and just after, what was really surprising was that even when the debt went over 90%, there was a significant possibility of inflation ballooning up and actually prices becoming exorbitantly high. But what really happened was that the inflation within the United States was hovering somewhere around 1.5 to 2.5%. Now, that was kind of possible because of the fact that the central banking system interfered again, and it sort of steered it in between that particular bracket. The next interesting confounding variable that we saw, which also sort of dictated what really happens during these phases of economic crisis and how does it impact the overall economy, was sort of the capital mobility index and whether or not the investment cycles keep flowing even when there is a crisis. So in North America, we actually saw a very positive index of capital mobility, and that's the reason why recovery had a significantly higher chance in North America than in a lot of developing countries. And so Europe was significantly liberalized, and there was cash flow coming in, but with the US, it definitely showed both positive trajectories in terms of de facto and de jure capital mobility index. And the final confounding variable that we looked at was how does the macroeconomic factors kind of gets impacted at the finer edge cases. And the two metrics of analysis that we tried to use to construe significant insights from that is co-skewness and co-kurtosis. Now, co-skewness as an index really tells you when one of the macroeconomic factors sort of changes pretty drastically, what impact does it has on the rest? And the co-kurtosis factor really tells us about the interrelationship between these variables over a significant period of time. And basically also, like in the finer edge cases along tail ends, how do some of these variables pencil out? And what we really observed was that, especially when we look at data across North America and Western Europe, both of these indices were really, really high. And so oftentimes, a spike in one really has an adverse movement in other variables. So having said that, what we really came across was a picture that was very interesting that Reinhardt and Rogoff gave us, but really there were certain phases within the timeline where we saw a different picture. And we were asking ourselves, how do we account for these confounding variables across different countries? And we give a new framework to think about some of these macroeconomic factors across time and across geographies. And one of the frameworks that was really that we sort of looked at a few preliminary research that was done on this particular topic. And one of them that stood out is a dynamic framework that tracks evolution across clusters. Now, essentially, the idea was to take a temporal analysis across time and sort of across multiple variables and convert that into a categorical framework analysis where we can definitely track how over a period of time the position of some of these countries and some of these macroeconomic factors, how do they evolve? So what was really interesting about this is we can track phases along the timeline where for a certain country, one of the variables, it does not move across multiple brackets. For some countries, the volatility, which means how much does it vary across different categorical brackets, that is very dynamic. And that information, actually what it does really two things. Because while creating these categories, we were considering data of macroeconomic variables across multiple countries, it really gives you a pertinent information as to how do these variables actually change over time, but with respect to other countries. So what it did really well, it gave us a framework to really analyze the evolution of these variables across time and with respect to other countries. Moving on, so this is what the picture looked like for some of the countries. So as you can see, what we did actually, just to introduce the methodology here, we were initially looking at a clustering method like k-means, where we group the data together and we see how the data points, they evolve across clusters. But that was really not giving us a significant information with respect to it was not giving us like information with respect to what does the brackets or the clusters that are formed using the value of k they represent in the first place. So we had to take a different approach for this methodology, and what we ended up doing was we did a quartile-based analysis where we clubbed the macroeconomic data of these countries together, and then we divided them into multiple categories based on what particular position within the interquartile framework do they find themselves in. So whether on a given period, whether the value of a macroeconomic factor goes below Q1, or is it between the median value and Q1, or is it between the median value and Q3, or is it above the upper bound of the box plot. So box plot analysis and using a quartile framework throughout the countries was really helpful in looking at how do these variables sort of vacillate across countries and across a period of time. But with that, we also needed something else. We wanted to really we really wanted to give certain metrics towards the end, once we have the graphs in place, to really analyze that if we have this data in place, and in the future we are looking to use this particular framework, what are some of the metrics or certain KPIs that will be helpful in actually dictating how the policies are, how we can define cogent economic policies to keep those macroeconomic variables in check. And some of the variables that, or some of the metrics that we ended up calculating from those graphs included volatility, persistence, reversals. I'll show you more on what these came out to be in the later slides. And so while we were plotting the quartile plots for multiple of these countries, here were some of the interesting observations that we found. What was very interesting was that you can see the consistent position of some of these countries across a particular timeline, and then the way they move up and down kind of shows you that with respect to some of the other countries, how have the policies impacted the macroeconomic factors that they have vacillated from that particular position, and they have either gone up or down. Now, Japan was a very interesting case in our study because the macroeconomic variables within Japan itself, they kind of were steady for a certain period of time, then they kept going up. As compared to the United States, where the post-2008 phenomena was quite emblematic, because towards the 2000s, the trend was quite stable, but post-2000s there was significant upward trajectory, and then post-2008 the upward trajectory was a lot faster. So this is sort of our final graph that we demonstrated. So just to reiterate what I said, if you look at Japan, this was the sort of consistent yet overall upward moving trajectory. For the US, which is right up there, you can see the post-2000 upward trajectory that sort of went above and beyond the upper bound. And this was what the overall trajectory for the number of countries that we were analyzing for looked like. And this sort of gives you a much more, I would say it's a much more veritable approach, given the fact that policy implications really come to manifestation within a certain period of time. So if our analysis kind of looks at different periods rather than across a time period, for example, 80 or 90 years, then what we really miss is what are some of the ways in which beyond a certain point in time, for example, we can take 8 to 10 years, how have those policies manifested and what changes did they precipitate in some of these countries? And that was sort of one of the most profound implications of this particular methodology. So what we really ended up giving, apart from the other indices, was, apart from really tracking trajectories, what we wanted to demonstrate is how do I measure, or what quantity I can use to measure similarity or disparity in the macroeconomic growth across different time periods. So one of the interesting metrics that we have in statistics, it's called the Hamming distance, which kind of shows how similar or different two sequences are. Now, with respect to our analysis, what we also had to do was we stuck with the regular Hamming distance, which kind of gave a good a prognosis of how the trajectories have evolved. But we also had to take into account that a shift from, let's just say, a macroeconomic variable at a certain point in time, it's between, let's just say, Q1 and the median, and then there is a significant shift that goes beyond, let's just say, between Q3 and the upper bound. Now, that is a significant shift as compared to a shift that happens between only one step. Now, the number of steps is also like a metric that we use, depending on how volatile these trajectories are. So we had to take into account a much more weighted approach in Hamming distance to show how significant these trajectory changes are. And so what we did was we used a regular Hamming distance, while at the same time we incorporated a modifying Hamming distance that takes these weights into account and demonstrate what is the impact of the shifts in economic trajectories of some of these changes. Now, overall, we wanted to give a number, or we wanted to give a final metric to sort of gauge what percentage of time do, if we do like a holistic comparison across countries, what percentage of time do these countries don't find themselves replicating same economic trends? And we calculated a final metric towards the end, which was the Hamming diversification index from the regular and modified Hamming distance. And the number came out to be 0.72 across North America, Western Europe, and Scandinavia, which really sort of told us that 72% of the time over the last 70 to 75 years, majority of these countries have demonstrated different economic trends. And across these countries, we wanted to demonstrate whether or not there was a possibility to maintain some form of fiscal sanity, and where are some of the areas where the economic indices kind of ballooned out of proportions. And this was the penultimate table that we had in our paper, which sort of demonstrated some of those additional matrices that would tell you how volatile some of the movements across macroeconomic variables were for each of those countries. And to go into sort of some of these factors, volatility sort of tells you how dynamic these shifts were in between countries. Number of steps tells you sort of how many times have vacillations being occurred over a period of time. Range span tells us what was the maximum value that the factor reached versus what was the minimum, and the difference between that. And these factors kind of gave a much more cogent idea as to, rather than looking at a trajectory over 70 to 75 years and doing a manual comparison, now we have a much more defined metric that tells you over a period of time and over short periods of time, how have these macroeconomic factors changed. And if you guys want to read the full paper, I have put the DOI number on top. You will have access to this paper, and the journal has pretty much given free access. So that would be my presentation. Are we within time?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay.
Yeah, we have time for questions. So.
Yep, we can have time for questions. Yep.
I'm curious if your research says anything about like what you think sustainable debt levels are today, because you basically said like what was previously assumed doesn't seem to hold true. So
Yeah.
you know,
That's an interesting question. It really, what really would dictate, at least I can say for predominantly for the US and the UK, it's that is you can control for increased debt through the Federal Reserve as long as you do not devalue the currency to the point where you are seeing just exorbitant price rise. So the perfect answer will be really depending on what are the market conditions in and around that time, how are the businesses structured, what is the market volatility, and given that and given those conditions, there are two specific actions that the central bank can do to sort of manage the debt. One is either you play around and you sort of plummet the interest rates, or you kind of take into account and pour more money into the system, temporarily increasing the inflation but controlling for some of that growth. So it's a very nimble process, and but I would say that if there can be a bracket somewhere. If I have to give an estimated number, I think I have to figure that out, like what's going to be like a good range. But the factors that will define it, I think those are pretty much the ones.
but you were saying that like historically,
Yeah.
we're kind of past the point of what was
Yes.
done in the past, so it's new territory.
Yes. Yes. So I think the data was sort of pretty well defined in terms of post 90. We were seeing the hypotheses given by the authors kind of failing, particularly for Western countries which have much more robust institutions. But at the same time, there are other factors like I spoke about in one of the slides, how kind of devaluation really also is a major phenomenon, because it's almost like you're playing around with multiple levers, but as soon as you control for one, you risk the other failing, right? So I would say that if the estimated numbers are for just to be on the safer side of things, if it's between 75 to 85% of the GDP, or on the upper side, it somewhere crosses a little above 95%, I think it's pretty manageable. But I think beyond that, there have been instances where we have seen growth, but also it risks much more ancillary factors like devaluation.
I have an opposite question,
Yep.
maybe, which is like totally removed from economics.
Right.
Where do you see this being like applicable other places as well? Do you see other opportunities where you think that this would be a good fit or a bad fit, or I don't know, maybe you don't have an answer to that. But
Yeah, no, I actually, it's very interesting that you asked that question, because, so as I mentioned, we started this project somewhere around late 2024, early 2025. And since then, actually, a lot has changed, even over these last 9 months. And so I was talking about this with my professor, and we are sort of planning to update a few of the points within this particular research, because what we are trying to look at now, and I think this would get to the heart of your question, is given that now we are seeing a greater disparity in how the economy within the US is kind of oriented, because so much of the investment is going into artificial intelligence and development of large language models. Does the economic patterns demonstrate the risk of the creation of and the eventual busting of asset bubbles, and whether or not it replicates the boom and bust cycles that we saw during the 2008 crises? And so we are planning to sort of accrue more data to see that how investments have flown across the private sector in 2025, and then use the same methodology, albeit adding a few variables, to see how have these trajectories changed over the last, let's just say very recently, 1 or 2 years. So to me, I think to answer your question, I think it will be very interesting to gauge how the economy is being impacted due to significant AI investment today, and whether or not it risks the creation and the eventual busting of an asset bubble. Yep.
I think one of the things that is so important is that was kind of bringing in, recognizing the importance of the Federal Reserve Bank and the confounding factors. And I'm wondering how you kind of account for that. Like, how do you give weight to that in the analysis? Because it obviously does play in, and
Yeah.
and the way you kind of group and cluster it makes sense with, yeah.
Yes. So that's an interesting question because from a purely quantitative standpoint, it's really hard to it's hard to sort of factor in how the actions of the Federal Reserve will have a consequence on macroeconomic variables. But what it really tells us is that when we are doing analysis, let's just say an ancillary analysis for countries like the United States, there are often more confounding variables involved than if I would do an analysis for a Scandinavian country or like a country in the developing world, because there are so many levers like the Federal Reserve can pull to manage how these macroeconomic factors kind of move. And so I think the best way to sort of gauge that is to do a pre-analysis of, let's just say that the interest rates are being adjusted at a certain period of time. You do a pre-analysis before that, and you do a post-analysis, and then you gauge, okay, if I don't adjust the actions of the Federal Reserve, how does it impacts my movement of the movement of these macroeconomic variables? This was actually a remnant of one of the slides I would go to. So this was an analysis that even Reinhardt and Rogoff did when they were looking at, how macroeconomic factors are impacted at the heart of an economic crisis. And what they did was they took a few years pre-crisis, so they called it like moving t minus 4 years and t plus 4 years, and seeing how these factors have evolved before, in the midst of, and after the crises. And what will be helpful to do is take that and actually extrapolate it in an environment where we are looking at these factors pre and post the passing of, let's just say, a policy from the Federal Reserve.
Treatment effect.
That yes,
Yep.
yes. But what will it involve is, and this is very interesting because it will sort of make our analysis much more granular. So now you can see that the data set was across years, right? What will be interesting to see is if we can just increase the aperture of the time period that we are looking at, and we divide it by months, how much more we can construe from our analysis. So that would be one of the ways in which we can incorporate that.